Ida Early Comes Over the Mountain by Robert Birch. Changes. Ida wouldn't leave us, said Dewey. Randall was glad someone could be certain of it, but when the twins were out of earshot, he said, "You know, she may be gone for good." "Yes, I know," said Ellen. "She must have really been disappointed in us." "I'm disappointed in us," said Randall, and he and Ellen talked for a long time about what had happened. It was after dark when Mr. Sutton returned home, and the twins greeted him with, "Ida's not here." They said it at the same time. "I know," said Mr. Sutton. "Has she gone forever?" asked Clay. "Of course not. She left word for me at work that she wouldn't be here tonight. I don't know what came up so suddenly. Somebody saw her hitchhiking on the road to Gainesville." Then he teased the twins. "Which one of you plans to cook supper for us?" "We'd rather play Tiddlywinks," said Dewey. "All right, you play Tiddlywinks," said Mr. Sutton, giving Dewey a playful swat. Then he turned to Ellen and Randall, who were studying at the table. "Be putting your homework aside," he said, "and let's see what we can do about something to eat." They cleared away their books, and Randall set the table while Ellen poured a glass of milk for each place. Mr. Sutton fried country bacon that he called streak-a-lean, but he almost burned it. He said that it could be called streak-a-charcoal this time. "Never mind, the gravy'll be good," he said, adding flour to the drippings in the skillet. "I should be able to make thickened gravy, wouldn't you think?" But when he poured milk into it, the mixture thickened too much. Even when he'd filled the skillet to the brim, the mixture still looked more like pudding than gravy. He dumped it into the bucket of scraps behind the stove. "Mayflower could have it for breakfast," he said. "Maybe she'll like my cooking." Randall looked into the cupboard. "Even if the gravy had been all right," he said, "there's no bread to eat it with." Finally, Ellen found string beans that Aunt Ernestine had canned during the summer. They were heated, and the rest of the supper consisted of soda crackers and sardines from a shelf in the pantry. During the meal, Mr. Sutton said, "Probably there'll be other times Ida'll want to get away for a while." Winking at Randall, he added, "In which case it might not be a bad idea if somebody here at least learned how to make biscuits." Ellen said, "Well, just because I'm the only girl doesn't mean it has to be me. Besides, I've heard that real chefs are—" Clay interrupted her. "What are chefs?" "Cooks at big eating places," said Ellen, "and they're nearly always men." Mr. Sutton laughed. "Oh, okay. So Randall and I'll learn to make biscuits." In the morning, Ida had not returned, and in the afternoon, when the children got home from school, Randall doubted she was there. Everything was too quiet. Usually when she was home, she'd call out to them before they were halfway up the driveway. He opened the door, and Dewey squealed, "Ida!" She was sitting on the other side of the table reading the paper. The twins dashed around the table and scrambled into her lap. "We're glad you're back," said Dewey. "Don't ever leave us again," said Clay. Randall thought that Ida looked different. Then he realized that she was wearing a new sweater. It was button-up, the same as her old one, but it was not as bulky and did not have patches on the elbows, and it was pink, very pale pink. She looked up at him and Ellen. No one said anything for a moment. Then Randall said, "Howdy, Ida." He tried to sound especially friendly, but he was afraid he'd overdone it and had sounded insincere instead. "Hello," said Ida flatly. Usually she said, "Howdy," good and loud when she greeted anybody. Randall didn't recall ever hearing her say hello to anyone. She looked away after she'd spoken to him. Ellen said, "Welcome home, Ida." "Thank you," said Ida, still with no feeling. There was another silence. Randall studied the sad expression on Ida's face. Her eyes did not have their usual sparkle, and she looked as if she'd never smiled in her life. He decided it was her downcast expression that made more of a difference in her appearance than the sweater. At the same time, the sweater didn't seem right for her. It was too soft a color for someone as robust as Ida. Or maybe he'd just become accustomed to seeing her in the brown one. He was trying to think how to begin an apology about the schoolyard incident when Ellen said, "I like the new sweater. It's pretty." "Thank you," said Ida, her voice still flat. Randall then blurted out, "We're sorry about what happened at school." "Yes, we are," said Ellen, "and if we—" Ida interrupted her. "Don't let's talk about it." There was a brief silence again, and Randall expected the twins to answer what all this was about. Instead, Dewey asked Ida, "Will you read us the funnies?" "Read us yesterday's, too," said Clay. He added angrily, "Nobody else would read 'em to us." Randall said, "You didn't ask for them until after you were in bed and the lamp was blown out." Dewey said, "Ida would have read 'em to us, wouldn't you, Ida?" "Yeah," said Clay. "I bet you could read in the dark, couldn't you, Ida?" "I can do anything," said Dewey, flipping through the newspaper to find the comics. It was not until after she had read the comic strips to the twins and they'd climbed down from her lap that Ida stood up. No one had noticed till then that she was not wearing overalls. She had on a dress. It was a pale green one with dark green leaves printed on it. Dainty yellow flowers were sprinkled among the leaves. The dress hung loosely on her and was longer on one side than the other. Randall remembered how particular his mother had been in making certain that the hems of her dresses were always even. He looked again at Ida. He wondered where she'd found a dress big enough for her. Then he remembered that there was a small factory in Gainesville where dresses were made. So that was it. She'd gone there to buy the dress. She was trying to fix herself up, he knew, but that was silly. Why didn't she wear whatever suited her? Of course he knew the answer, and if he had had the guts to speak up yesterday, he told himself, nobody would have laughed at Ida about her clothes. He looked at her shoes, and was glad that at least they were the same as they'd been, though the thought crossed his mind that the brogans might not go with her dress and sweater. In the afternoon, Ida went over to the shelf near the icebox. Time to do the milking, she said. I'll do the milking, said Randall. I can take that job back if you'd like. I'll keep doing it, she said. But you're too dressed up, insisted Randall. Ida took down the pail from its shelf. Women milk cows wearing dresses all the time, she said. Cows wearing dresses? Said Clay. Everybody laughed but Ida. No, women wearing dresses, she said. She didn't smile, but she patted Clay in the head as she started outside. Now that's what I call a good supper, said Mr. Sutton, pushing his chair back from the table. You outdid yourself, Ida. Thank you, said Ida, starting to clear the table. Randall and Ellen helped her. The twins and Mr. Sutton stayed at the table. Quite an improvement over last night, wouldn't you say, boys? Said Mr. Sutton. Last night was awful, said Clay. Aw, now, said Mr. Sutton, we did the best we could. Breakfast was awful, too, said Clay. Was that stuff really oatmeal? Mr. Sutton laughed. No, I think it was mule feed that was put on the pantry shelf by mistake. Maybe Ida'll show us how to make good oatmeal. She won't have to show us, said Clay. She's back now, and she'll make it for us, won't you, Ida? Sure, said Ida from across the room, not sounding at all enthusiastic about it. She stood over Mayflower's scrap bucket, scraping leftover mashed potatoes into it. She made a little noise. Usually when she was scraping out a dish, she'd bang the spoon against it, even tapping out a rhythm. Of course, she didn't always stand over the bucket. Sometimes when the contents of a pan or bowl were not to be saved for another meal, she'd throw them into the bucket from halfway across the kitchen. Things like baked potatoes or biscuits were easy. Randall and Ellen had learned to throw them. But Ida could hurl other things as well. A double backhand shot, she'd said the night she'd thrown 2 squash halves over one shoulder and a helping of spaghetti over the other. And her specialty had been mashed potatoes. She could load them onto the big end of a mixing spoon or flapjack turner and flip them an amazing distance. They'd land with a plop in Mayflower's bucket. But now she stood over the bucket, scraping the potatoes into it as anyone else would have done. She was not herself, thought Randall, and it made him sad. Mr. Sutton explained to the twins, I mean that just in case we're ever on our own again, we should know more about cooking than we do. He added firmly, I, for one, am going to learn. When no one joined him in the resolution, he said, Anyway, we mustn't take Ida for granted. What's for granted? Asked Dewey. It means we mustn't act as if Ida's been given to us. We hope she'll stay with us, but this is a free country, and, well, who knows? She might decide someday that she can't put up with us any longer. He looked at Ida as if he expected her to say something. When she didn't, he continued, or maybe some rich, handsome prince will come riding out of the woods one day and grab her up and go galloping off to Nashville or someplace. The children laughed, but Ida didn't. Mr. Sutton looked puzzled. He had expected Ida to carry on with the joke. Clay said, I thought you said there weren't any real princes and princesses around here and that such things only happen in make-believe. Well, I was making believe, said Mr. Sutton. Anyway, said Clay, no prince could grab Ida and take her away if she didn't want to go, could they, Ida? Not likely, agreed Ida. Dewey said you'd grab his horse by the tail with him sitting in the saddle and sling him round and round, wouldn't you, Ida? Plumb off the mountain, said Ida. She did not smile. Well, said Mr. Sutton, if nobody likes my stories, run get a book and let's read a real one. Quickly Dewey fetched Grimm's Fairy Tales, and Mr. Sutton read aloud to the twins and anyone else who cared to listen. Randall, putting away pots and pans after Ida had washed and Ellen wiped them, tried to make as little noise as possible. He liked hearing his father read aloud. When the dishes were washed, Ellen brought out the checkerboard and put it on the table. Here's a present, she said. For us, said Dewey. What is it? No, said Ellen, it's for Ida. But what is it? Asked Clay. A checkerboard, said Randall. Maybe we'll play something besides tiddlywinks around here for a while. But we don't know how to play checkers, said Dewey. We'll teach you, said Randall, but it's Ida's board and she gets to be first. Who you want to play, Ida? I'm going to bed, said Ida. Let somebody else be first. You're not sick, are you? Asked Mr. Sutton. No, I'm not sick. If anything's wrong, I hope you'll try to let us help you. I'll be all right. You don't seem quite yourself, said Mr. Sutton. In fact, you don't look quite yourself either. He looked surprised now as if he had not seen her during supper. Why, I knew something was different. You're not wearing overalls. He waited for her to reply. When she said nothing, he added hastily, the dress looks nice, but why are you sprucing up so? She hesitated before starting over. Her voice had quavered a bit, and Randall knew that she was embarrassed. He hoped his father wouldn't insist on knowing what was the matter. I just figured it was time I tried to look a little better, Ida said at last. Mr. Sutton smiled. You always look fine to us. We want you to be happy. That's what we care about. When Ida said nothing, he added, I'm glad you're not sick or anything. As Ida started from the room, she said softly, There's nothing wrong. She did not sound at all sure of herself. Checker games and the curling iron. One afternoon when Randall and the twins went down to the mailbox, there was a package for Ida. Let's hurry back to the house and see what's in it, said Dewey. But it's to Ida, said Randall. Yes, I know, but she'll show us. Inside, Randall gave Ida the package. She put it on a chair and went ahead scraping carrots for supper. Aren't you going to open the package? Asked Clay. No. But don't you want to know what's in it? He said. I know what's in it, said Ida. Then she added, Come on, let's go read Moon Mullins. We need something to make us laugh. She read Moon Mullins and the other comics aloud, and Randall noticed that the twins laughed. She didn't. But that night at supper he saw what had been in the package. Instead of brogans, Ida was wearing a pair of women's shoes. They were made of black patent leather and had low heels and straps that fastened on the side. They reminded Randall of the ones worn by a lady tap dancer who put on a program at school last year. Ida hobbled when she walked to them as if they hurt her feet. Every day afterward, Ida wore the new shoes, although Randall believed they were too small for her. Finally, she could walk in them without limping, and she wore them everywhere, even to the barn to do the milking. After supper, whenever Mr. Sutton wasn't too busy or too tired, he played games with the twins or read to them until their bedtime. Recently he'd been teaching them to play checkers. Sometimes Randall would play too, and occasionally Ellen. Ida early went to bed as soon as the dishes were washed and put away. One night Mr. Sutton said, Ida, it's not like you to turn in so early. Why don't you play checkers with us? Some other time, said Ida, and she went ahead to her room. The next night Mr. Sutton said, Well, Clay and Dewey are about to get the hang of checkers, but they could still use a little coaching. How would it be, Ida, if I helped one of them and you helped the other? I guess that'd be all right, said Ida, putting away the dishcloth. She sat down beside Dewey and gave him advice during the game. Dewey won. Next she helped Clay, and Clay won. It was the beginning of the checker sessions that Mr. Sutton called nightly attempts to beat Ida. Nobody succeeded. Several times Randall believed he was about to win a game, only to find that he'd been trapped. Ida would make a clever move and wipe his men off the board. One evening while the game was underway, Ellen came into the room with a curling iron. I ran across this today in Mama's things, she said. I believe I'll curl my hair. She looked at her father as if she expected him to say, No, you can't do that. Your hair looks fine to me the way it is, he said. But if you've got the patience to try curling it, just be careful that you don't get the iron too hot and burn yourself. I'll be careful, said Ellen, hurrying to put the iron on the stove. Checker games continued, and when the twins' bedtime came, Dewey said, Ida, how come you don't laugh when you win? Yes, said Clay, you used to laugh lots. Just haven't had much notion to, I guess, said Ida, folding up the board. But maybe I'll get back in the habit. She smiled at Randall. He wished he could think of some way to cheer her up. How's it look? Asked Ellen, coming near the big Aladdin lamp in the center of the room. She had finished trying to curl her hair. Clay said, It looks curly. That's the way it's supposed to look. Turn around, said Mr. Sutton. Let's see it in the back. Ellen turned around. Does it bush out too much? She asked. Maybe just a little, said Mr. Sutton, but it'll settle down. He reached out and pulled her to him. I'm not sure that I'm ready for you to be so grown up, but then I guess there's no stopping you. He kissed her and added, You look pretty. 2 days later, when the children came home from school, Ida's hair had been curled. Randall saw the curling iron on the back of the stove. No two strands of Ida's hair seemed to go in the same direction. Clumps of it stood out from her head as if they'd been wired. Strands drooped, others stood straight up. There was one lock that was Z-shaped. Even sadder looking was Ida's expression. Randall felt sorry for her. He thought of the day Ida had arrived and how her hair had reminded him of the scarecrow's. But since then he'd grown to like it. The shaggy mop effect might not look nice on all women, but it had been right for Ida. In the same way, her overalls and brogans had looked more appropriate than the dress and shoes she wore now. Possibly he'd become accustomed to seeing her in the new outfit, but he doubted that he'd ever get used to the startling change in her appearance made by the curling iron. Neither he nor Ellen said anything when they looked at Ida, and even the twins were quiet for a moment. Then Dewey said, "Maybe it'll look better when it settles down." Ida lifted him off the floor and gave him a hug.